Welcome to DairyPod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
Hi, I'm Steph Bullen and I'm the National Animal Health and Welfare Lead at Dairy Australia. Today I'm joined by Dr Sam Rowe, who I've asked to come on the podcast today to talk about some of his experiences working with flood-affected farmers in New South Wales recently. Sam, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a dairy herd health vet at University of Sydney, and I graduated from vet school about 15 years. And I really love my job because I get to do a combination of, research into sort of farm-based problems that dairy farmers primarily have to sort of face, but then also I get to teach, the next generation of livestock vets, and then also offering clinical services to dairy farmers in New South Wales, where we work. So the university has a clinic, and we visit dairy farms in our area. So that's the sort of work that we do.
Can you tell us a bit about your background, Sam? How did you get here?
Yeah, so I originally grew up in the bush in the NT, and then went to vet school in Townsville at the James Cook University, and really planned on getting into, I thought I was going to be a small animal vet, a dog, cat vet, but somehow was swept up in a whole lot of enthusiasm about livestock veterinary.
And we're very glad for that.
Yeah. Yeah. So and then from that point on, then really sort of wanted to learn as much as I could about farming systems and helping farmers and problems that farmers face. And so that led me to work at a vet clinic in North Queensland in the Atherton Tablelands, and really loved the time that I had there, learning from the vets there and the farmers up there. And then did some study after vet school, doing a PhD, and went overseas to the University of Minnesota in the US, and really sort of built a deep and, appreciation for epidemiology, which is the study of diseases, on a sort of a more herd level, and particularly sort of applying that to mastitis problems and other problems like reproductive problems on farms. So, then that sort of, then eventually I made my way back to Australia, and now I'm at Sydney, and sort of still working on those same problems, still really trying to, generate knowledge that's useful for farmers, help them manage health-related and production-related issues that they face.
Yeah, awesome. So the reason we asked you to come on the podcast, Sam, is to talk about your recent experiences working with farmers up in New South Wales following the floods. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to be involved in that, and the work that you and your team members did?
Yeah. So, the flooding that happened in sort of May this year, the DPI in New South Wales contacted our clinic. They were, credit to them that they worked to have a really rapid response to support the farmers that were affected by the flooding, which was really severe in the mid-north coast. And so they were in touch with us before the roads were open, and then we were able to send up a team of vets that included me to visit the flood-affected farms in that area. Primarily for us, it was around Taree and Kempsey. It was a bunch of dairies up there that were severely flooded. So they contacted us, and we sort of put together a bit of a rough plan about how we could help, and really were trying to improvise a bit at times about how best we could support those farmers.
So Sam, maybe you can perhaps start by telling us a little bit about how some of those farms were affected.
Yeah. So we observed a range of effects across a number of farms that we visited, and starting with the most sort of severely affected farms, where cows had drowned and washed away and lost to full, and really severe situations for those farms, and then farms where the milking shed had gone underwater, cows weren't able to be milked, Cows weren't getting access to feed. And that was very common. A lot of farms were severely affected with that. And so obviously when cows aren't being milked, we saw huge spikes in clinical mastitis. Cows were starting to dry themselves off, which is very concerning. The milk production was really much lower once they were able to start up milking again, because they weren't being fed and because they hadn't been milked, and the cows were ceasing to lactate because they thought that they were being dried off. So that was a real challenge for the farms, for them to know what to do with those cows, with those problems. We also saw a lot of health problems associated with the floods. Not only is it because of the environmental effect of cows being in mud and being crowded together in the holding yard and not having a sort of a clean, comfortable environment to be able to sleep in, but also because of the transmission of bugs that occurs when they are sort of congregated together like that, and really not having a really comfortable place to rest, which we know can predispose them to lameness problems. So, that meant that we saw, as I said, a lot of mastitis, but then we also saw, a lot of cows with sore feet and lameness. So we spend a fair bit of time picking up cows' feet and, detecting lesions and, and treating cows with lameness lesions. And then also other infectious sort of type problems like pneumonias in calves in adult cows as well. So, I guess a sort of combination of lots of different health-related challenges on those farms that were really stressful for the farmer. I think that was one thing that they really appreciated about having, a team of vets, from our group and from others, showing up and saying, how can we help? I think that they really appreciated that we were there to help their cows, and that was, I think, for a lot of farmers, one of the things that was most stressful for them was to see their cows in such poor shape, and knowing that there were people there to help those individual cows that had needs for veterinary support. So that was some things that we saw. I guess in addition to that, we saw a lot of destruction of the farm infrastructure. So fences and paddocks kind of totally ruined, and I think, as I mentioned, feed being spoiled and washed away and ruined, and the paddocks were trashed, and if they had stored feed, hopefully it was on high ground. If it wasn't, it was gone, and really severe effects there. And then we saw a real variation from farm to farm, though. Some, even though they might have had similar levels of flooding, some farms seemed to cope a lot better than others, and had managed to get through it at the time that we visited, which was quite early on after the floods, seemed to be faring better than others.
Yeah. And Sam, were there farms that, through all the devastation, some of the lessons that we could potentially take out of that and apply to future, this is going to happen again, for sure. But were there farms that were better, that were able to navigate it better because they had particular, things in place or systems in place, or, I remember you talking about just shortages of antibiotics and things like that. Were there farms that were able to navigate this better than others because of things that were sort of within their control? I know a lot of it was out of their control, but, what would be kind of lessons for next time?
Yeah. So I think that we definitely observed a spectrum of the impact, and we're still, I think, piecing together what those learnings are, and we really want to look at that in a really systematic way if we can, and do some research into what are those things that drive resilience in those situations. I can think of one farm where this farmer's the entire grazing area went underwater. The only area that wasn't underwater was the holding yard and the dairy, and then a couple of mounds where he put the dry cows and the heifers and things like that. But because he was able to keep milking the cows, he was able to keep feeding the cows because he had, backup feed on hand. he was able to not see massive spikes in mastitis rates. He was able to maintain the productivity of his cows. He really was coping pretty well. I mean, he wasn't getting any sleep. He was absolutely wrecked when we saw him. And he still had, some stress cows that were developing pneumonia and things like that. But he wasn't in that absolutely dire kind of scenario that we did see on some other farms. So perhaps some of that was to do with his preparation. I think that he had those things in place before the flooding came. He had the feed ready. His dairy was in a position where even with the flooding, it was able to continue operating. Even if maybe he wasn't able to have the milk picked up, he could still milk the cows. The electrics and the systems in the dairy were able to continue to work. He had a backup generator to be able to run the plant. I think that those things were all really pivotal for him. Obviously, if the entire farm goes underwater, there's not a lot you can do in those situations. But he was one of the most flooded farms in that region. But because he was able to keep milking the cows, he was able to keep feeding the cows. That really seemed to be a key thing for him. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess another thing also that seems, I think, is a lesson coming out of that, perhaps less relevant to that particular farm, but having good quality records and data on the farm really helps make decisions, particularly difficult decisions. A lot of cows got dried off early, cows going to the meatworks. When you just don't have enough feed to feed the whole herd, you've got to manage that population of animals to be a suitable number, obviously knowing that once they're out of the milking herd, they're not coming back. You're not going to replace those numbers quickly. So obviously it's a difficult decision that farmers were having to make. So knowing who those cows are that need to exit the milking herd, either from being sold for a slaughter or dried off early, or even parking them at other farms, having that information there to make those decisions with as much confidence as you can is really valuable. So that is like knowing the basic things about a cow, like how many days in milk she is. And this is all year-round calving herds. So you've got cows at all different stages of lactation. And so obviously you dry the cows off for the later in their lactation, keep the ones that are in early lactation, because you get a better feed convergency efficiency in those early lactation cows. But knowing the parity of the cow to know, that's useful information. But then knowing the pregnancy status of the cow, having pregnancy
start. I don't want to dry her off if she's empty.
Yep. Knowing what the mastitis history of an individual cow is, knowing what her production index is, how valuable is that cow to your herd right now versus another cow, so that you can make the decisions that, confidently. And it's hard to make those decisions when you certainly that's what we observe. Farmers really stressed, making high impact decisions. It's good to have that information there to make those decisions.
Yeah. It's so pertinent. And I think talking to you and your colleague John, sort of in that immediate, aftermath period, I think you were spending a lot of time preg testing cows, weren't you, just to help support some of those decisions. So, yeah, being prepared sounds really important. In terms of other health challenges and young stock, you mentioned some farms having trouble with pneumonia and things like that. So the mastitis probably obvious, I think, particularly with missed milkings and things like that. But did you see any other challenges on those farms, and were there things that some farmers were able to do to help manage that risk or fare better than others?
So I think that, we did definitely see some outbreaks of infectious diseases. So obviously, when there's a lot of rain, we worry about the environment causing diseases like environmental mastitis, but then you can also see contagious diseases, infectious diseases that spread from cow to cow. The cows are often then really congregated in, crowded together particularly when there's nowhere else for them to go. They used to be in a paddock, now they're in a holding yard, sitting there on concrete. They're very stressed. So you see more transmission of bugs between cows and things like pneumonia. When they're stressed, they're more likely to catch those infections. So I think, again, in those situations, you might not be able to really do anything to prevent the transmission of some of those viruses, but being able to detect when a cow gets sick, when a cow gets, say, pneumonia, or a calf has pneumonia, we know that one of the major factors that determines the outcome for that calf is how soon that calf gets treated. Again, I think that comes down to having really good systems in place, particularly on bigger farms. We have staff having systems in place where the staff know what a calf with pneumonia looks like. How do you check if a calf has pneumonia? If the calf looks vaguely unwell, well, what are the next steps that you need to take to then come to that point where you then end up giving that calf the right treatment? And you obviously can't, it's really hard to train people in the middle of a crisis. Whereas if you, in preparation with those sorts of things, I think it makes sense even when you're not in a crisis to be able to have systems in places, protocols ideally that have been, really well hashed out with a vet that knows the farm really well, to be able to have a system in place for diagnosing and treating those things. So I think that is an important factor to consider. Another disease that we or health challenge that we observed was cows having sore feet and lameness.
Yep.
Again, that probably a lot to do with cows spending a lot of time on concrete. A lot of the farms, there literally was nowhere for the cows, the milking cows, to go, so they were in the holding yard. And in some farms, that holding yard was a concrete slab that the cows would stand on or lie down on, sleep on for days, weeks. And that's not
grave,
not a great environment for cows' feet. The feet get really wet and soft, and then if there's a rough surface that they're walking on, that can penetrate through the sole and cause injuries and bruises and things like that. And so, that's just a really difficult thing. There wasn't a lot that a lot of farmers could do about that in the short term. The farms that had padding around in their holding yard, which some farmers do have.
So sort of rubber mats. Yeah, okay.
Cows love those. Farmers who have them know that cows really like them, and certainly when that was where the cows were sleeping, they much preferred that, obviously, than the concrete. So I guess you don't know when you buy those rubber mats that maybe that's going to be a bed for the cows at some point.
Yeah.
But in that case, thinking of a particular farm, it certainly was a really valuable thing for that farmer to have a comfortable place for the cows, for them to rest. Cows don't like, if they don't have a comfortable place to lie down, they'll stand up for as long as they can until they have to. And that process of not having as much lying time does put a lot more stress on their feet. It predisposes them to developing claw horn lesions in their feet and going lame, having lameness, having thin soles, potentially having bruises and all those sorts of problems. So, and obviously those farms now are really struggling with lameness because for those of them that are back in the paddocks, the laneways are all pretty,
destroyed.
Yeah, really destroyed.
Yeah.
So they don't have that sort of good, clear surface for the cows to walk on. And we know that that's a massive thing that drives lameness in pasture-based cows.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, one of the things that we were talking about just briefly before we jumped onto the podcast was the sort of thought, you've got your clinic there at Sydney Uni as well as the sort of research arm, and you're sort of thinking about doing some sort of longer term follow-up with these farms to see how they got on, and what, you talked about having some really kind of, clear data around, how we might be able to better prepare kind of going forward just to minimise those risks. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking there? I know it's really early days, but sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, very early days. But what we want to do is learn as much as we can from this experience, and in our case, apply the skill sets that we have at our clinic, which is that we are clinicians. We go to farms and pick up feet and all those things that dairy vets do. But then we also have a real special interest in using data and information as much as we can to go the next stage in learning and being able to help. So what we're currently thinking through is how we can best quantify how the floods have affected these farms in terms that make sense to dairy farmers and I guess from, in our case, dairy vets. So we think that, for example, the reproductive effects are massive, that these cows, these are year-round calving herds, so there's a combination of pregnant cows and empty cows in the herd. But obviously none of those cows were being bred throughout that period. A lot of those cows went without feed for a long time. So that really affects their ability to cycle and to get pregnant. They lose a lot of weight, things like that. So as an example, we really want to be able to quantify what that reproductive impact was with the flooding. I think so that we can then build up a knowledge base about, well, this is what a flood does. And that's the first step that you take to then work out, well, then how can we mitigate those effects? I don't know if we're going to come out of this particular instance with a really clear roadmap for how to navigate these sorts of situations, because they're very difficult situations to deal with. I think that we have learnt a lot though. And the idea that we have is to really sort of put that down in from our perspective as like a scientific paper, research study that can really formalize what we know, try to reach out to as many experts as we can to sort of understand, these impacts. And I guess I use the reproductive example, but we'd like to look at a whole lot of other things. We'd like to look at the mastitis rates, which we know were, diabolically high on the farms that were affected. 30% of the cows with mastitis on a given day. Let's imagine that 100 cows, say, with mastitis, that you've got to work out what you're going to do with those 100 cows. That data is useful because when we were preparing to leave to go up to the farms, we weren't really sure what to expect. What is going to be happening on these farms? So building up a sort of a really thorough understanding of that, I think is valuable. And then obviously other impacts that we think that we observed and think we want to really quantify is around the number of the cows that were slaughtered prematurely, sent for slaughter, cows that were dried off early, the production losses. We certainly saw when cows aren't milked for a day or two, they start to dry themselves off. That is a massive problem, and a lot of cows, when there were those long periods without being milked, really hard to reestablish their milk production. So a huge cost to that farm, not only in the short term with loss of stock and, penalties potentially for cell count and clinical mastitis and losses of milk, but then more, mid and long-term effects. You don't see the immediate effect of a reproductive problem for quite some time. Wow. You then start to see that you don't have as many replacement animals in the herd. So that you can't afford to cull as many animals that have got high cell counts. And so all of a sudden the cell count goes up, and all these things can take some time to really be realized fully. So that's part of some work that we'd like to do to be able to better understand how this flood has affected the farms in that area.
Yeah, and as you said, sort of be better prepared for you guys in terms of, what needs to be considered in terms of a response and ideally preparation, but at least in a response, yeah. So Sam, thanks so much for sharing your experiences, and it sounds just awful for the farmers and the cows, and I think it was probably pretty challenging for you guys at times as well, just seeing the scale of kind of devastation up there. But to kind of wrap up the podcast, Sam, I'm interested for you to sort of summarize, I guess, your 3 to 5 things that you would like listeners to know about the experience, whether it's, things that lessons that you've learned that that'll stick in your mind, or advice that you give your clients now going forward? Yeah. What are your kind of 3 to 5 big take homes that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So I think thinking through what can we do to prepare, I think is something that I've thought a little bit about. And I think that they're basic things, but I think from what we've observed, being able to maintain that milking process, those milking routines as much as possible is really important. And I was amazed to see how much the farmers were trying to do that. Half the farms that we went to, they showed us a video on their phone of them milking in waist-deep water. The pit's full of water and the cows are up to their ankles in water and they're still milking the cows. That really was, I think, a really important lesson for me, that's just so important. Obviously, if the farm's underwater, that's not possible. But the things that could be done to help prepare for that would be to make sure there's backup power, to make sure that you've got a way to, I guess, make your milking parlour, your milking shed as resilient as possible to those sorts of potential shocks, so that you can milk the cows in almost any conditions, if possible, if you can. And then I guess equally important is being able to keep the cows fed, knowing that when those cows are off feed, their milk production goes right down. Obviously, everyone knows that. But having some backup feed is so important. And
full silo of grain is the thing that's like immediately in my mind, Sam. If this is sort of forecast, if you can, maybe top up silos and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. If you can having some stored forages and concentrates,
fiber,
would be really helpful. Having infrastructure to be able to feed, and obviously every farmer has a different philosophy on how they want to feed their cows, and some people really like buying feed or producing their own feed or pasture only. Certainly with flooding, if all you have is pasture, then you've got nothing when those paddocks are underwater. And so having something as a backup in this situation was just absolutely critical for the farms. And when the roads were closed, it was hard to get feed in, so it took a while. So they were really desperate. The farms that didn't have something there, they were really desperate for feed when it did come. I think another sort of lesson for me is being able to manage health well. You really need to have good systems in place in advance. Disease treatment protocols, protocols for being able to detect diseases, knowing how to check the herd for mastitis, knowing how to check that if the calves have got pneumonia, those sorts of things, and then knowing what to use for treatments, and then having a good relationship with a vet that can help give you advice, even if they can't be there, if the flood waters are keeping them out. I think that's really important. Having access to medication, having medication on site to be able to deal with spikes in diseases when they occur. We certainly saw that was a massively important challenge that farmers had, is they just didn't have the medication to be able to treat all the cases of particularly mastitis that they were seeing.
All right.
And then just another thing that I think was an important part of being prepared in this situation was having good data and records on the farm to be able to make decisions under pressure in short periods of time that had a lot of, that were really impactful decisions about which cows get to stay and which cows have to go on the farm. And to have that data that's been routinely collected, having it available is really important, I think. And I think then just the final thing in terms of preparedness is knowing who to call and having that support network. Obviously, it's such a difficult, and I can't imagine just the absolute struggle that it was for the farmers that were affected. And we certainly saw that when visiting and talking to farmers. They were absolutely wrecked. By the time that we got there, they were just so tired. Some of them were really angry. Some of them were pretty discouraged. I was amazed to see how much the community the community of farmers were supporting each other. I remember we'd go to farm, and we were trying to get to as many farms as we could, so we couldn't spend all day at one farm. And the second that the farmer knew that we were trying to get to the neighbour down the road, they'd only bring in the cows that they definitely needed to see, and they wouldn't want to take up too much of your time because they knew exactly how affected their neighbour down the road had been. And so that was a great reminder, I guess, about how dairy farmers do look after each other, and that network is so important to have. They all knew how affected each other were, and then beyond just the community of dairy farmers, but then all the support, the support that also exists for dairy farmers, whether it's the government and DPI or Dairy Australia, or in our case, Dairy New South Wales as well. And then the other local service providers, vets and technicians and people like that. I think having a good network really matters in those situations when you're struggling.
Yeah.
And then obviously having people to talk to when you're struggling personally with a lot of stress, I think is also really important to emphasize as well in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, it's been an amazing discussion, and it sounds like a pretty life-changing experience, but certainly, by all accounts was hugely appreciated by the farmers up there and certainly by us at Dairy Australia, the support that you were able to mobilise rapidly and go up there to support. So thanks so much for coming on and sharing a bit about your experience and some of the lessons, and let's hope that this doesn't happen again for a long time. But it sounds like there has been some really good, tips that you've taken out of it that can hopefully set us up to minimise impacts going forward. So thanks so much for joining us, Sam.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.